So something that I've wanted to do for a while is build myself a better case. And having some time off from my day job for the holidays, it was the perfect opportunity. For reference, if you haven't seen it in my other videos, this is my Eurorack case. It is nothing more than some scraps of laser cut plywood with Eurorack rails screwed in from the sides. At this point, I've already started to take the case apart to reuse the rails. But as you can see, there isn't much to it. It does not even have a back. I want to build something a little more robust that I can actually put into the back of my car and feel good about the safety of the modules during transport. Once the old case was completely disassembled, it was time to start the new one. I wanted to make this one a rectangle with all 4 rows at the same level. No 45-degree sections or anything like that. With the wood cut, it was time to put it together. I used my mini drill press to drill all the pilot holes perfectly vertical. Then I measured out the spacing for the rails, double-checked it about a dozen times, and again used the drill press to make sure the holes are perfectly straight. I drilled the holes for both sides of the case together after clamping them so that the rails, once mounted, would be guaranteed to be parallel with each other. And I did cheat a little here. I have about an 1/8 inch gap between each row and between the top and bottom row with the exterior of the case, just so that I could be sure that everything would fit. Then it was just a matter of screwing everything together. I used some modules temporarily mounted to each set of rails to make sure my spacing would be correct. I don't think I mentioned this before now, but I'm making 2 identical cases. And when done, they will be attached together with hinges and latches to make a suitcase-like setup. This is why the rails are set so far in from the front of the case halves, is to allow for room for knobs and any patch cables that I decide to leave attached when the case is closed. Now back out to the saw to cut the back panels. This is going to be out of a 1/4 inch plywood. These panels are screwed to the sides of the case. The panels stick out a little bit now, but it will be sanded to final dimensions at a later step. Next, it was mounting the power supply. For those of you playing at home, I'm using a Meanwell RT125B, which should be plenty of power for a case this size. FYI, all Meanwell power supplies use 3mm screws as mounting hardware. Now, I didn't want to screw through the sides of my case to mount this power supply in case I ever needed to change it. So I mounted the power supply to a piece of plywood first by transferring the mounting screw positions by painting the screws with a black paint pen and then pressing the plywood into the still wet paint. This gave me good enough marks to then drill out and counterbore before attaching back on the power supply. Next, I wanted to lay out where everything else I wanted to put into the case would go. Mainly a reverb tank and some power supply strips. Something like this ought to do it. So I cut out some plywood strips to mount to the back of the case to provide something for the mounting screws to bite into. With the back of the case being only a 1/4 inch thick, I didn't want any screws poking through the back. These plywood strips were glued in place to match the mounting holes of the reverb tank and power supply strips. To make things easier to see once the case is being used, I decided to put a couple coats of gloss white paint on the inside. Once the case is full of modules, or the room is dark, this will make changing connections on the modules much easier. Then it was back outside to bevel all the corners. I'm going to wrap the outside of this case in tolex. It makes it much easier to do when you have about an 1/8 inch radius on all the corners. After a coat of spray adhesive on the back and the sides, the tolex was wrapped around and trimmed to fit. Corner guards were installed on all 8 corners to protect them and to hold the tolex in place. On the inside, I used some nickel-plated tacks to hold down the tolex. And with that, it was time to install the power supply and the reverb tank. And then I needed to figure out where I wanted the power connection and the on-off switch. The lower corner on the right side looked correct, so then it was only a matter of drilling a hole and using a Dremel tool to widen it out to the shape of an IEC socket. Next, it was the same procedure with the power switch. On the inside, you can see where all the connections are relative to the power supply. Then I set up my soldering station right on top of the case to make the connections. After removing the remains of the last project that a switch was used for, it was time to solder in the new wires. I added heat shrink as I went to try to make this thing at least a little safe. The neutral wire also runs to the switch because this switch has neon illumination when you turn it on. With the AC wiring done, let's give it a test. Okay, no smoke. Now let's see if we have all 3 voltage rails. Okay, all the rails look good. Now let's make the IEC connector and power supply just a little safer with a big ball of hot glue. The connections on the power supply itself will be addressed later. And just in time from the PCB factory, my own power strip boards showed up in the mail. I'm going to make a more in-depth video on how to assemble one of these later, but honestly it's not that complicated. With 3 strips put together, let's see how they fit in the case. I think I want them about here. Time to screw them in place. And now to run the wire from the strips to the power supply. All I had lying around was 14 gauge wire, which is way too thick. I would recommend you use 18 gauge, and it will fit much better. And after a few minutes, all the usual wires are in place. Now for the gimmick of my power strips. First thing I need to do is solder wires to a switch that I mounted to some old test panel. And connect it to some of the terminals at the far end of each of the power strips. Now if we turn on the power to the case and turn off the lights and turn on that switch, boom, all the light you could ever want from LEDs mounted to the underside of the power strips. Plenty of light to plug in a module, but not enough to blind you. Now I need to go and put all my modules in this case. I'm kind of feeling a layout like this. Anyways, it looks like we've reached the end of the video. Hope you all enjoyed. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.